Some men are born soldiers. Others are forged in the crucible of impossible moments, moments when everything they believed about themselves shatters, and from the fragments, something unbreakable emerges. This is the story of a thin, bookish recruit who was never supposed to be on the front lines, a clumsy sergeant who dropped his equipment at the worst possible times, and a commander so cruel that his own men feared him more than the enemy. On the night of July 4th, 1976, these three men descended into the darkness of Entebbe Airport in Uganda, where over 100 hostages waited for rescue or death. What happened when the recruit's M16 jammed at the most critical moment would forever change. How the commander saw courage, and how the recruit saw himself. Stay until the end, because sometimes the weakest link becomes the unbreakable chain. The heat inside the C-130 Hercules was suffocating. Private Joseph Brenner pressed his back against the vibrating metal hull, feeling every tremor of the aircraft as it cut through the African night. At 200 feet above the ground, his hands were shaking. He tried to hide them by gripping his M16 tighter, but the trembling only transferred to the weapon itself. Across from him, Sergeant Mizrahi was fumbling with his ammunition pouches for the third time, his thick fingers refusing to cooperate with the simple clasps. Mizrahi was a big man with a kind face, the kind of soldier who always seemed to be apologizing for taking up too much space. Tonight, his clumsiness felt like a bad omen. Commander Ari Galili stood at the front of the cargo bay, his eyes scanning his men like a hawk surveying prey. There was no warmth in those eyes, only calculation. Galili had earned his reputation through fire and blood. He had lost 12 men in the Yom Kippur War 3 years earlier, and something inside him had calcified into stone. He believed that kindness killed soldiers, softness bred weakness, and weakness invited death. His method was simple: break them in training so they would not break in battle. The men feared him. Some hated him, but all of them followed him because in the chaos of combat, Galili's orders were the only thread connecting them to survival. In war, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. Napoleon Bonaparte Joseph caught Galili's gaze and quickly looked away. He knew what the commander thought of him. Too thin, too intellectual, too hesitant. Joseph had been studying mathematics at the Hebrew University when his conscription orders arrived. He had dreamed of numbers, of elegant proofs of the quiet life of a professor. Instead, he found himself in a ceremonial selection course, pushed beyond every limit he thought he had. He had nearly washed out 7 times. Each time, something stubborn inside him refused to quit. Not courage, he had none of that. Just a deep, quiet refusal to accept defeat. Galili had passed him reluctantly, calling him the mistake I will regret. The aircraft banked sharply, and several men grabbed the overhead straps to steady themselves. Through the small porthole, Joseph could see nothing but darkness, the impenetrable African night that would either conceal their approach or swallow them forever. Somewhere ahead, 4,000 kilometers from home, 106 hostages were being held at Entebbe Airport by Palestinian and German terrorists. Among them were elderly Holocaust survivors, children, pregnant women, Israeli citizens whose only crime was boarding Air France Flight 139 from Tel Aviv to Paris. The hijackers had issued their demands: release 53 convicted terrorists, or the hostages would die. The Israeli government had chosen a third option: Operation Thunderbolt, a surgical strike across hostile territory under the cover of darkness, against an enemy that held every advantage. Military analysts around the world had called it suicide. The distance was impossible. The intelligence was incomplete. The margin for error was 0. But Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin had made the call, and now 100 elite commandos were hurtling toward Uganda in for transport planes, carrying with them the hopes of a nation and the weight of history. The more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in combat. General George S. Patton Sergeant Mizrahi finally secured his ammunition pouch, letting out a small sigh of relief. He caught Joseph's eye and offered a sheepish grin. "My hands forget how to work when I need them most," he whispered. "In my village, they used to say I could trip over a painted line." Joseph tried to smile back, but his face felt frozen. Mizrahi had been assigned as his fire team partner, the man who would cover his back when bullets started flying. The thought was not comforting. Mizrahi was brave, fiercely loyal, and had the worst luck of anyone Joseph had ever known. In training exercises, he had accidentally discharged his weapon twice, both times into the ground. He had fallen through a rotten floor during an urban warfare drill. He had once gotten his boot stuck in a doorframe during a breach exercise, holding up the entire team. But Mizrahi had one quality that made officers tolerate his disasters. He never abandoned a comrade. During a grueling mountain march in the Judean desert, when Yosef had collapsed from dehydration, it was Mizrahi who carried him 3 kilometers on his back, even as his own legs cramped and failed. When other soldiers mocked Yosef for his thin frame and bookish manner, Mizrahi stood between them like a wall. He was clumsy with equipment, but never with loyalty. And tonight, as they flew toward what might be their deaths, Yosef found strange comfort in the big man's presence. Commander Galili raised his hand, and the cargo bay fell silent. 30 minutes to insertion, he announced, his voice cutting through the engine noise like a blade. Final weapons check. I want every magazine counted, every chamber verified. If your weapon fails you tonight, you have already failed your country. His eyes swept the rows of soldiers, lingering on Yosef. There are no second chances in Entebbe. No reinforcements. No rescue for the rescuers. You will either complete the mission or you will die trying. That is the only mathematics that matters tonight. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is more important than fear. Ambrose Red Moon Yosef pulled back the charging handle of his M16, checking the chamber for the 20th time. The weapon felt heavy in his hands, heavier than it should. He had qualified as a marksman in basic training, surprising everyone including himself. But the paper targets on the range had not shot back. They had not screamed or bled or begged for mercy. He wondered if he could pull the trigger when the time came. He wondered if he would freeze, as he had frozen so many times in training simulations. He wondered if his trembling hands would betray him at the moment of truth. The C-130 began its final descent toward Lake Victoria. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. They would land at Entebbe Airport posing as a Ugandan presidential motorcade, using a black Mercedes identical to dictator Idi Amin's personal vehicle. The confusion would buy them precious seconds, perhaps enough to reach the old terminal building where the hostages were held. Before the terrorists could execute them, every second counted. Intelligence estimated they had less than 15 minutes from touchdown to extraction. 15 minutes to save 106 lives. 15 minutes to make the impossible possible. The wheels touched African soil at exactly 11 p.m. local time. The cargo ramp dropped, and the black Mercedes rolled out into the humid night, followed by Land Rovers carrying the assault teams. Yosef's heart was pounding so hard, he was certain the terrorists could hear it from the terminal. The vehicles moved smoothly toward the old terminal, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Ugandan soldiers at a checkpoint stared in confusion at what appeared to be their president's motorcade arriving at midnight. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Sun Tzu, then everything went wrong. A Ugandan sentry, more alert than his comrades, raised his rifle and shouted a challenge. The lead vehicle was supposed to pass unchallenged. The entire plan depended on surprise. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Netanyahu, commanding from the Mercedes, made a split-second decision. He could not risk the sentry alerting the terminal. A silenced pistol coughed twice in the darkness. The sentry fell, but the damage was done. His partner had seen and was already running toward the terminal. Screaming warnings into the night, the commandos abandoned stealth and switched to speed. The Mercedes accelerated toward the terminal as soldiers poured from the Land Rovers. Sprinting across the tarmac, inside the old terminal, the terrorists heard the gunshots and the shouts. They had trained for this moment. They had promised to execute hostages at the first sign of rescue. In a room filled with terrified civilians, a German terrorist named Wilfried Bies raised his Kalashnikov and pointed it at the crowd of Israeli hostages. He had 60 seconds to decide whether to become a mass murderer. Yosef was in the second wave, his team assigned to secure the eastern corridor while the primary assault force hit the main hall. His legs felt like lead as he ran toward the terminal, his M16 clutched against his chest. Beside him, Mizrahi was gasping for breath, his heavy frame struggling to keep pace. Commander Galili was ahead of them, moving with the fluid grace of a predator, his weapon already up and scanning for targets. The sound of gunfire erupted from the main hall. The assault had begun. Who dares wins. British Special Air Service motto, they entered through a side door, moving in tactical formation through the darkened corridor. The smell of old concrete and stale air filled Yosef's nostrils. Somewhere ahead, he could hear screaming, the high-pitched wails of terrified hostages mixed with the sharp cracks of rifle fire. His training took over, pushing fear to the back of his mind. Move. Cannot breathe. Move. Scan. Breathe. The corridor opened into a smaller room, and there, silhouetted against a window, stood the Ugandan soldiers fumbling with their weapons. Commander Galili dropped them both with precise 3-round bursts before Yosef could even raise his rifle. Keep moving, Galili barked. The east wing, we need to secure the exit route. They pushed deeper into the building, past overturned furniture and scattered belongings left behind by fleeing airport workers. The sounds of battle from the main hall were intensifying. Yosef heard Hebrew shouts, commands, confirmations, calls for medics. The primary team was engaging the terrorists. The hostages were somewhere in that chaos, their survival measured in seconds. They reached a junction in the corridor. To the left, a stairwell led to the upper floor. To the right, a heavy door marked the exit to the tarmac. Their mission was clear: secure this exit for the hostage evacuation. But as Galili moved toward the door, a burst of automatic fire tore through the wall beside them. Yosef threw himself to the ground, his face scraping against the concrete. Mizrahi crashed down beside him, his helmet clattering against the floor. Someone was shooting at them from the stairwell. In the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. Albert Einstein Galili returned fire, his weapon blazing in controlled bursts. Brenner, suppress that stairwell. Yosef scrambled to his knees, raising his M16 toward the source of the gunfire. His finger found the trigger. He squeezed. Nothing. He squeezed again. Nothing. The weapon was dead in his hands. A cold wave of terror washed over him as he realized what had happened. His M16 had jammed. The bolt was stuck forward, the action frozen. He worked the charging handle frantically, but it would not budge. His weapon was useless. More bullets ripped through the corridor, showering them with concrete dust. Galili was cursing, his magazine running dry. Mizrahi was trying to return fire, but his position was exposed, and Yosef knelt there with a useless rifle, his worst nightmare coming true. He was the weak link, the liability, the mistake Galili had always known he was. In that moment, every doubt he had ever harbored about himself crystallized into a single, crushing certainty: he was going to get them all killed. But then something shifted inside him. A voice that did not sound like his own spoke from somewhere deep in his chest. It said, "Not today. Not like this." Time seemed to slow as his mathematical mind, the same mind that had solved complex proofs while other soldiers played cards, began to calculate. The shooter was on the stairs, elevated position, firing in bursts of 3, pause of approximately 2 seconds between bursts to readjust aim. The pattern was predictable, exploitable. It is not the strength of the body that counts, but the strength of the spirit. J.R.R. Tolkien. Yosef dropped his jammed rifle and drew his sidearm, a Browning high-power pistol that every soldier carried as backup. 13 rounds. That was all he had. But 13 rounds, placed correctly, could change everything. He waited for the next burst of fire, counting in his head. 1, 2. The burst ended. He moved. What happened next would be discussed in Sayeret Mackle training courses for decades. Yosef Brenner, the thin, bookish recruit who could not do 10 pull-ups, sprinted directly toward the stairwell. Not away from danger. Toward it. His pistol barked twice as he ran, the shots placed precisely where his calculations said the shooter would emerge. He heard a scream of pain, saw a body tumbling down the stairs. But there was a second shooter higher up, and Yosef was completely exposed in the open corridor. He did not hesitate. He dove forward, sliding across the concrete floor as bullets cracked overhead. His body hit the base of the stairwell, and he twisted, bringing his pistol up in one fluid motion. The second shooter appeared above him, Kalashnikov leveling down. Yosef fired 3 times. The first shot went wide. The second caught the terrorist in the shoulder. The third struck him between the eyes. The man collapsed backward, his weapon clattering uselessly against the metal railing. The harder the conflict, the greater the triumph. George Washington's silence fell over the corridor, broken only by the distant sounds of the main battle. Yosef lay at the base of the stairs, his chest heaving, his pistol still raised. He had 7 rounds left. His hands were not shaking anymore. Commander Galili appeared above him, staring down with an expression Yosef had never seen on his face. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Galili reached down and offered his hand. "Get up, soldier," he said quietly. "The mission is not over." They secured the exit corridor just as the first hostages began streaming through. From the main hall, Yosef saw their faces pale, tear-streaked, eyes wide with shock and desperate hope. An elderly woman clutching a child. A man in a torn business suit supporting an injured comrade. A young mother shielding her baby with her own body. These were the people he had come to save. These were the lives that mattered more than his fear. He felt something transform inside him as he watched them pass, a fundamental realignment of who he was and who he could become. Mizrahi appeared beside him, his face covered in dust and sweat. "You are insane," the big sergeant whispered, his voice filled with awe. "You ran straight at them. I thought you were dead. I thought we were all dead." He gripped Yosef's shoulder with his massive hand. "You saved us. That thing you did, I'd have never seen anything like it." Yosef did not know what to say. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. But beneath the exhaustion, something new was burning. He had faced his deepest fear and emerged on the other side. "I hated every minute of training, but I said, don't quit. Suffer now and live the rest of your life as a champion." Muhammad Ali, the extraction was chaos. Ugandan soldiers were responding from the military barracks nearby, and sporadic gunfire erupted across the airport as the commandos fought to hold their perimeter. The hostages were loaded onto the C-130s as quickly as possible, many of them still in shock, unable to fully comprehend that their nightmare was ending. Medical teams worked frantically to stabilize the wounded. Yosef helped carry stretchers, his arms aching, his lungs burning from the exertion. And then came the news that silenced every celebration. Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu, Yoni, as his men called him, had been shot during the assault on the main hall. The bullet had struck him in the back as he led the charge into the terminal. The commanding officer of the entire operation, the warrior who had planned every detail and inspired every soldier, was gone. The price of freedom had been paid in the most precious currency, the blood of the brave. As the C-130s roared down the runway and lifted into the night sky, Yosef sat with his back against the cargo hold wall, staring at his hands. They were scratched and bruised, covered in concrete dust and someone else's blood. But they were steady. For the first time in his life, they were completely steady. Commander Galili sat across from him, his weapon across his knees, his eyes fixed on the young soldier he had once dismissed as a liability. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. "Winston Churchill, the thing you did," Galili said finally, his voice barely audible above the engine noise, running toward them. "That was not in any training manual." Yosef met his commander's gaze. "The manual assumes your primary weapon works," he replied. Something flickered in Galili's eyes, not quite a smile, but close. "You were supposed to call for cover fire. You were supposed to fall back to a defensive position. Instead, you charged an entrenched enemy position with a sidearm." He paused. "It was the most tactically unsound thing I have ever witnessed." Yosef felt a flash of the old fear, the dread of disappointing his superiors, of being exposed as inadequate. But then Galili continued, "It was also the bravest thing I have ever seen." The words hung in the air between them. "I was wrong about you, Brenner. I thought you were soft. I thought your mind would make you hesitate when instinct needed to take over. Instead, you used that mind to calculate an attack that no conventional soldier would have attempted." He leaned forward. "You saw a pattern. You found a weakness, and you exploited it without hesitation." Sergeant Mizrahi, who had been pretending to sleep, opened one eye. "He also scared 10 years off my life," he muttered. "I thought I was watching a ghost run past me." Despite everything, Yosef felt a laugh building in his chest. It escaped before he could stop it, a sound so unexpected that several soldiers nearby turned to look. Mizrahi grinned his big, sheepish grin. "Next time, give me warning before you become a hero. My heart cannot take surprises. We make war that we may live in peace." Aristotle, the aircraft, flew on through the darkness, carrying its precious cargo of rescued hostages and weary soldiers. Somewhere below, the African continent stretched out in sleeping silence, unaware that a small group of men had just accomplished the impossible. 102 hostages rescued, 3 hostages killed in the crossfire, 1 soldier fallen. The mathematics of the mission were brutally simple, yet they represented something far greater than numbers could convey. They represented hope. They represented the message that evil would not go unanswered. They represented the eternal truth that ordinary people, when called upon, could become extraordinary. Yosef looked down at his jammed M16, still slung across his chest. The weapon that had failed him had, in a strange way, revealed him. If it had worked properly, he would have simply been another soldier firing from cover. He would never have discovered what he was capable of becoming. The failure had forced him to improvise, to adapt, to find reserves of courage he never knew he possessed. Sometimes, he realized, our greatest limitations become our greatest teachers. Commander Galili stood and moved toward the cockpit, but paused beside Yusuf. When we return, he said quietly, I am recommending you for advanced training, sniper qualification, intelligence analysis. You have a gift, Brenner, the ability to see patterns others miss, to remain calm when chaos reigns. That gift should not be wasted on regular infantry duties. He placed his hand briefly on Yusuf's shoulder. The man who boarded this aircraft in Israel was not the same man who will disembark. Remember that. Growth requires pain. Transformation requires fire. They've got us surrounded, the poor bastards. General Creighton Abrams, as dawn broke over the Sinai Peninsula, the C-130s began their final approach to Israeli airspace. Word of the mission's success had already spread across the globe. In Jerusalem, crowds were gathering to welcome the returning heroes. In capitals around the world, military analysts were scrambling to understand how the impossible had been achieved. And in Yusuf's mind, a new understanding was taking shape, one that would guide him for the rest of his life. Strength was not measured by muscle or weapons. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the conquest of it. And every person, no matter how weak they seemed, carried within them the seeds of heroism, seeds that would only bloom when watered by extreme adversity. The thin mathematician from the Hebrew University had become something more, not because he had wanted to, not because he had trained for it, but because when the moment demanded everything he had given it without reservation. Sergeant Mizrahi nudged him awake as the wheels touched down on Israeli soil. We are home, brother, he said softly. We made it home? Yusuf looked out the porthole at the familiar landscape of the desert, the same desert where he had nearly died during training marches, where Mizrahi had carried him on his back, where Commander Galili had pushed him beyond every limit. It looked different now. It looked like possibility. It looked like the beginning of everything that was yet to come. Stay hard. The world is not going to give you anything. You have to go out and get it. David Goggins, the hostages were reunited with their families in scenes of tearful joy. The soldiers were celebrated as national heroes. Memorials were held for Lieutenant Colonel Netanyahu and the fallen hostages. And life went on, as it always does after moments of extraordinary drama. But for those who were there, for the men who descended into the darkness of Entebbe and emerged into the light of legend, nothing would ever be quite the same. Years later, when young recruits asked Yusuf Brenner about that night, he would tell them about the jammed rifle. He would tell them about the moment of terror when his weapon failed. And then he would tell them what he learned in those desperate seconds, that equipment can fail. Plans can collapse, and everything you depend on can disappear in an instant. What cannot be taken from you is the fire inside, the will to fight, the refusal to surrender. These things cannot jam. These things cannot malfunction. These things are yours forever if you choose to claim them. Commander Galili retired 3 years after Entebbe, his reputation secured, his methods vindicated. On his last day of active duty, he sought out Yusuf, now Captain Brenner, leading his own unit of elite soldiers. They stood together on the parade ground where it had all begun, watching the next generation of recruits struggle through the same brutal exercises. I still remember what you said, Yusuf told him, that I was the mistake you would regret. Galili nodded slowly. I was right, he said. You were a mistake, the best mistake I ever made. Impossible is just a word thrown around by small men who find it easier to live in the world they've been given than to explore the power they have to change it. Muhammad Ali Sergeant Mizrahi remained in service for another decade, his clumsiness becoming legendary throughout the Israeli Defense Forces. He never stopped dropping equipment at critical moments. He never stopped tripping over obstacles that did not exist. But he also never stopped putting himself between danger and his comrades. He received 3 commendations for bravery before a training accident finally ended his career. At his retirement ceremony, Yusuf gave the main speech. This man, he said, pointing to Mizrahi's beaming face, taught me that courage has nothing to do with coordination, that loyalty has nothing to do with perfection, that the heart of a warrior can beat in the clumsiest body imaginable. The story of Operation Entebbe has been told in books and films, analyzed in military academies, and celebrated in countless ceremonies. But the story that matters most is not about tactics or logistics or international politics. It is about 3 men who discovered, in the crucible of combat, who they truly were. A thin recruit who found his courage, a clumsy sergeant who proved his worth, a cruel commander who learned to see beyond his own assumptions. Their story is not finished. It continues in every soldier who faces impossible odds and refuses to quit, in every person who discovers that their greatest weakness can become their greatest strength, in every human being who looks at fear and says, "Not today." I am not afraid of an army of lions led by a sheep. I am afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion. Alexander the Great, the rifle that jammed in the middle of the mission, now sits in a museum in Tel Aviv, displayed alongside other artifacts from Operation Thunderbolt. Visitors often pause before it, reading the small plaque that tells the story of Private Joseph Brenner. Children ask their parents why a broken weapon would be considered important, and parents try to explain that the rifle represents something beyond its mechanical function. It represents the moment when a young man stopped relying on external tools and began to rely on himself. It represents the transformation that combat can bring, not always for the better, but sometimes into something extraordinary. For those who understand, the jammed M16 is not a symbol of failure. It is a symbol of possibility. It reminds us that our limitations are not our destiny, that our fears are not our masters, that somewhere inside every uncertain heart lies the capacity for heroism, waiting only for the right moment to emerge. The soldiers who flew to Entebbe did not know if they would return. They went anyway. The man whose weapon jammed did not know if his pistol would be enough. He charged anyway. The sergeant who tripped over his own feet did not know if he could keep up. He ran anyway. And that is the lesson that echoes across the decades. From that distant night in Uganda to wherever you are reading these words right now. You do not need to be strong. You do not need to be ready. You do not need to be confident. You only need to take the first step when everything inside you screams to run away. You only need to keep moving when your body begs you to stop. You only need to believe, for one moment longer than your fear, that you are capable of more than you know. The only easy day was yesterday. United States Navy SEALs, some men are born soldiers. Others are forged in the crucible of impossible moments, moments when everything they believed about themselves shatters, and from the fragments, something unbreakable emerges. This was the story of a thin, bookish recruit who was never supposed to be on the front lines, a clumsy sergeant who dropped his equipment at the worst possible times, and a commander so cruel that his own men feared him more than the enemy. On the night of July 4th, 1976, these three men descended into the darkness of Entebbe Airport in Uganda, where over 100 hostages waited for rescue or death. What happened when the recruit's M16 jammed at the most critical moment forever changed how the commander saw courage and how the recruit saw himself. This is not just history. This is a mirror. Look into it. Ask yourself what you would do when everything fails. Ask yourself what fire burns inside you, waiting for the moment when it will finally be needed. The answer might surprise you. The answer might change everything.